and welcome to the Fintech Finance Victorine. I'm your host, Doug McKenzie, and on today's session, we're going to be examining the payments ecosystem and a company right at the heart of that. And joining me today are the co-founders of the company Primer, who we're going to be doing a little profile on today. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope you're both well. And I guess the best way to kick things off is actually to throw it back to you and kind of let our audience get to know you a bit. So, I mean, to kick things off, Gabriel LeRoux, one of the co-founders of Primer. How are you doing? And can you tell us a bit more about you and Primer, please?
Sure, I'm doing well. Thanks, Doug. So quickly about myself, I'm one of the co-founders of Primer. Before starting Primer, I was at Braintree and PayPal for about 5 years, where I've done quite a lot of things there, BD, sales, product in the US and in the UK. At Braintree and PayPal, I used to work with a lot of some of the largest customers, helping them create new commerce experiences and make the most of Braintree and PayPal suite of products. And this is essentially where I met Paul. And we both work on several projects together, and we saw the ever-growing challenges that merchants were facing when trying to expand their payment ecosystem. And this is why we decided to start Primer.
Incredible. Well, I'm so excited to kind of get your expertise from those days and really kind of hear how that has bled into Primer. So thank you very much, Gabriel. And also, Paul, thank you for joining us as well. How are you doing?
It's hot in London, so yeah.
It's this really horrible mugginess with very little to no sunlight. So it's just this horrible situation. But apart from that, are you good? Can you also tell our audience a bit about yourself too, please?
Yeah, briefly, I'm an engineer. I have an engineering background, and I was one of the first employees of a company here in London called DecoPay, and I helped them build the world's first retail finance payment method. And after I left that company, which I became CTO and managed an engineering team, I joined some of my ex-colleagues at Braintree and PayPal, and as Gabs mentioned, that's where we met. And my job was to transform the solutions team for Braintree and PayPal. And so that involved working with PayPal's much larger merchants across EMEA, but also globally, helping them to integrate Braintree and PayPal's products and technologies, and just generally helping them manage payments. So anyone from the likes of Skyscanner to Spotify and Uber and Airbnb and all of those really marquee merchants. While I was at Braintree and PayPal, I conducted hundreds of deep dive technical workshops with these folks, flying out 2-3 times a week, and got to gain a very, very unique understanding of how they manage payments from a technology standpoint.
It's absolutely brilliant. And to hear those household names and kind of, you can imagine that the numbers we're talking about when it comes to these payments, it just shows the scale of the industry and really how critical this technology is. So I guess really that leads me to my first proper question, and Paul, I'll stick with you on this. Where did the idea for Primer come from?
Well, I think that principally the challenge that I saw over and over again with meeting with these merchants' product teams and their engineering teams is that they had to constantly learn payments over and over again every single time they were integrating a new provider. But also, I think Gabs and I together, because we worked on a lot of merchant engagements together while we were in London. It was perfectly common and perfectly normal within a payments company such as Braintree and PayPal that the sales cycle would be really, really long, and it would be a really long time before the merchant actually started processing a payment with your service. But as I say, I'm an engineer and have an engineering background. And so what I saw was, the problem here was due to technical complexity and fragmentation. But also there's no uniformity when it comes to these merchants' payments infrastructures and payments ecosystems. So even some of the biggest merchants in the world doing tens of billions in transaction processing volume, their entire payment services stack is just like a hacked together monolith of spaghetti code, and engineers will understand the issues that surround that. And so really when merchants are thinking about expanding their payments ecosystem or offering better payments experiences to their customers, they have to kind of dive right back into that monolith of spaghetti code. And so the idea broadly stemmed from that, but also the understanding that the payments landscape is constantly growing and there's lots of really amazing innovation happening in payments, but merchants aren't able to leverage this within a reasonable time frame due to this technical fragmentation. So if we think about, changes in consumer behavior when it comes to how they pay, really those changes in consumer behavior are driven by new technologies. But those technologies, don't get adopted by merchants for some period of time due to technical fragmentation. Really good example of this would be the likes of Apple Pay and Google Pay. It took a really long time for some really big and marquee merchants to start accepting those payment methods, and the same is true of other payment methods as well. But I think a big insight that we got from working with these merchants was that their payment stack is about more than payments companies, and it's about more than payment services. Increasingly, merchants are leveraging KYC providers and payout services and loyalty and rewards platforms and BI tools and accounting software and recurring billing services and voucher systems, and the list goes on, right? In addition to proprietary payment methods and other payment services and so on. So there is nothing that connects these services together as part of a unified payment lifecycle. Merchants just have to make really, really big compromises, like, oh, maybe this PSP in this market is integrated with that fraud provider, and maybe this one is integrated with another service, and so on and so forth, right? And so once again, thinking about it purely from a technology standpoint, what was obviously missing here was just a completely agnostic software development framework almost for how you would think about building payments, and so we'll go into some detail in a little bit, but I guess we kind of see Primer as being equivalent to React.js for web applications. You have Primer for payments.
Yeah, well, I think you've really kind of given such a brilliant holistic view of the whole payments industry, and there's just such a gaping hole in the market because of this technological spaghetti, as you're referring to. And I'm going to kind of move on, but Gabriel, I also want to kind of hear your perspective as well. I want to hear your spark on this as well. Do you agree with Paul that it was just this frustrating failure of the industry, and Primer can really just come in, intersect into that, and really solve those issues for even these giant merchants?
Well, absolutely. I think that the one thing that we know today by working with all these large customers across the globe is payment and today is more than just like a simple transaction with one PSP, right? And as Paul was mentioning, like the merchants are getting more sophisticated and they want to use like several third-party services as part of their payment ecosystem. They also want to do that to create unique commerce experiences. But if they want to do that today, they need to sort of hack the system, right? They need to sort of integrate several services, which are going to be like working silos. And this is why you've seen like, those growing payments team, right? But, we know that these are like major challenges for merchant. And from the research we've done at Primer, we know that, on average, like an enterprise customer wanted to use at least like 4 different like payment services, right? And this number will obviously grow with Primer, because we give them the ability to activate pretty much anything they want in just a few clicks, right? So yeah, I mean, obviously this is something like for us to tackle, and we're building a technology and a framework so that they can accelerate their payment strategy and create unique payment flows.
Yeah. Now,
I think just to add to that though, I don't think that we would categorize this as a failure of the payments industry.
Right.
I think actually it's the opposite. It's that payments technologies are being created and expanding at such a rapid pace, but there is no unified platform, an agnostic platform that would power these particular things. I think everybody's familiar with the notion of a payment service provider, which is, traditionally a payment service provider would, effectively just enable you to accept payments online, right? So they would be your acquirer, and they would give you a full stack payment processing service. But PSPs were never designed with Apple Pay and Klarna and Google Pay and KYC services and payouts and all these, plethora of products and services in mind, right? The payments landscape is growing so significantly rapidly that now what is required is just a completely underlying technical infrastructure, right? So yeah, as I say, we don't consider it to be a failure of the payment space. We see it to be a kind of a side effect of the fact that merchants want to leverage best-in-class products, not from just across payments, but across from the web in general, right? And so that's specifically what Primer is positioned to help merchants, achieve.
Yeah, it is interesting, to hear that just born out of the success, of instant online payments, there has been this, as you said, plethora of in almost infinite new ways to pay and new companies to deal with, which large merchants don't, or even all the way down to small merchants, don't want to be focusing on. They want to just get paid. Now, looking at that transition through the payments industry and how that's changed, how that's developed, I'm interested to hear where Primer is now effectively. So Gabriel, I've got we've heard where the industry was placed perfectly for Primer to come in. Where are you guys at now?
Primer is a truly global company today, right? One thing that is extremely interesting with Primer is that we don't have to be financially regulated, right? We're never touching the funds at Primer, which means that we're actually a global company from day one. So we have now operations in the US, we have operations across Europe and the UK, but also in South Asia with a team in Singapore. This is quite a unique position, and the problem that we're tackling is a global issue, right? And we've seen that with Paul, like working with like global businesses. In terms of the company, we're more than 65 today. We have employees in more than 20 countries. And one thing that is quite interesting in Primer is that we actually are remote first, and we started as a remote company. And the reason for that is also because we want to be close to our customer, right? We want to understand the challenges they have. We want to actually understand the cultural challenges that they have to face when expanding their payment ecosystem. This is a small summary of where we are today as a company.
Yeah, and that's just got to be such an important point for a company that's really at the heart of the payments ecosystem. As we've heard all these brilliant new changes across the ecosystem, and that is granular around the world. You see some brilliant merchants and payment systems over in, for instance, as you said, Singapore, very different to over in the UK, for instance. So you need that kind of granular approach, it seems. And also, can I ask Paul yourself as well, where do you see Primer? And can you talk a bit more about this kind of remote first aspect too?
Well, what's quite interesting is that actually prior to starting Primer, Gabs and I were working, remotely with one another. He was in San Francisco and I was in London for the last year that we were at Braintree and PayPal, and so it was completely natural to us that you would have a remote first company. But also Primer was absolutely designed to be a global company from day one, as Gabs mentioned.
That's really interesting, Paul, and I'm also interested. The biggest barometer of where Primer is now. I know you can't give us specifics, Gabriel, but could I ask maybe some of the size or typical organizations you're going to be looking to kind of working with in the future?
Sure thing. So at Primer, we're mostly working with what we call mid-market to large enterprises. So businesses doing a substantial amount of volume online. We're talking here like millions of transactions, right? One interesting thing is that we could tackle pretty much all verticals, right? What Paul mentioned earlier, it's a global problem that we're tackling. It's a problem that pretty much any businesses is having today. They all want to use the best services online. They all want to have a cohesive fraud strategy. They all want to have a beautiful checkout. We have to be sort of pragmatic, right? So we are now going after a subset of verticals. So you could think of travel is one of them, food delivery, micromobility, mobility, fast fashion. And if you look at all these verticals, they all share some common challenges, right? They are, for the most part, verticals which are highly saturated. They need to have the best possible checkout experience. If not, the customer would switch from one service to another. They need to have a very diversified what we call a payment method mix. So a lot of different payment methods. Also a diversified card mix. And what's interesting is that in all these verticals, they're all looking at payments as a way to engage with their customer, right? And I'm sure you've seen that, when booking a meal on LeRoux, you've seen that, they now have a subscription service, right? Where you can actually pay a monthly fee so that you don't have to pay the delivery fee. Well, these are actually unique commercial experiences that these companies are creating to actually engage with their customer. And so that's something that we actually seeing across all sort of verticals and type of businesses, which means that they're all looking at payments as a first-class product area, like a way to create new experiences, a way to engage. So these are the type of merchant that we are actually going after at Primer.
Incredible. Now, Paul, you've kind of touched on it at the beginning of the conversation, but I think we need to dive into it a bit more because it seems to really be at the heart of what Primer is solving. And why is it that merchant payment ecosystems have gotten so complex?
Well, I think a large part of that is definitely wanting to make use of the plethora of payment services that people are now familiar with. We're seeing merchants that want to start offering, buy now, pay later, or payment methods like Klarna, or obviously Apple Pay and Google Pay, and and some of the commerce experiences that Gabriel mentioned. But the issue is that how do merchants facilitate a unified payments experience if they have this ecosystem of multiple payment services and payments providers? Because if you go and visit, some of these payment services, what you'll see is that they want you to do a direct integration with them. And so therefore, the checkout becomes very tightly coupled with the specific payment service that you're using at that moment in time. But the thing is, merchants don't actually think about payments in this way. They think about payments as, well, we want to deliver a payments experience to our customers. Now, who we happen to be using in order to process these payments or power these payments experiences is kind of something else. However, it actually isn't something else today. It's very, very, very tightly coupled. And so you get these really hokey payments experiences where if you go from the US to the UK, for example, you might just get a different checkout page for that same merchant, and your payment method isn't going to be stored there because maybe it was stored with Adyen and it wasn't stored with Stripe, and you don't know that as a customer, but that's what's happening under the hood. And then, as I say, from the merchant standpoint, they also may want to leverage other products as part of the payment lifecycle. So a couple of very simple examples of that would be a fraud platform, for example. So there are specialist fraud services, but what merchants need to do to leverage those in the best possible way is to send all of the payments information to those fraud services, ordinarily before the payment gets authorized. But of course, they don't have possession of that payment information because it rests with the specific payment service that's being used at that moment in time. And that's just a very basic example.
Gabriel, you also brought up as well that a payment isn't just a payment anymore. There's so much more attached to it. You're seeing with the real-time payments networks, for instance, in Australia, you can attach invoices now. It's just this complete overhaul of what a payment can be considered. And as you said, Paul, the merchant doesn't really know this. The customer, the consumer who's making the payment also doesn't know this, probably doesn't even care at this point because they have not been shown these new ideas or these new innovations, but they are changing. So Gabriel, can I ask, how are consumer behaviors changing, especially after 2020 and a massive e-commerce boom? How are you seeing consumer behaviors impacting merchants' payment strategies going forward?
Well, I think this is something that we sort of discussed earlier. I don't think it's so much like the consumer behavior that is changing, it's the payment landscape, right? So every month we hear about new payment services, that could be launched across the payment stack, right? I was reading an article this morning about buy now, pay later across the UK. There's a lot of these services today, which are all different in some ways, right? There's a lot of fraud solutions. We're working with, a lot of them today at Primer. And there's beyond that, there's also new concept, right? Open banking is now getting a lot of traction, and beyond the traditional use case, we see now account to account being one of the type of experience that merchant want to explore, right? So I think that's the big change in the industry, right? So all these new services will actually at some point push for some new behavior. And that's essentially what we're solving at Primer, because for a merchant to actually launch a buy now pay later solution or to A/B test open banking, it would take them a month to do that today, right? The concept of A/B testing in payments is actually impossible, right? You need to learn how to integrate the solution. You need to train your team. You have a new dashboard to which you need to log in. You have data which is going to sit with that provider. Well, with Primer, we're looking at this as, well, it shouldn't be like that. Well, you should be able to accelerate your roadmap. You should be able to test services. You should be able to create new commerce experiences, right? And you should be able to make sense of the data that you will get with that new service. So this is essentially what we're solving today.
I think one interesting point to be made about that as well are areas in which it's not so much that consumer behavior is changing, but that merchants need to meet consumers where they are. So when we speak to large merchants who are expanding to new markets, they're completely unfamiliar with the particular payments landscape of that particular territory and region. And it can be very, very wildly different from what they're used to. One of the trends that we always kind of notice at Primer is when very, very large merchants announce that they've raised tons and tons of funding and that they're moving into 28 different markets and it's on TechCrunch. And then really just a few months later, the inevitable announcement is made that we're actually scaling back a little bit. We're not moving into quite as many markets as we had originally intended. And we know that a very, very large part of this is because they've not been able to create a best-in-class payments experience and payment strategy for those customers in all of those respective markets. But Primer intends to resolve that entirely and to enable merchants to reason about payments in a completely unified way. So that's also one of the factors when we think about consumer behavior.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting you bring that up because we've talked about the complexity being at the heart of why merchants are struggling to kind of globally expand, but actually there's more to it as well. There's got to be that strategy there, and when you actually look at the regulations in various different ecosystems, they completely change. It's more than just the technology, isn't it? There's also cultural differences when it comes to payments. So Paul, you mentioned Lego bricks when it came to Primer. Are there any other ways or any other issues that are holding merchants back from global expansion when it comes to their payment side of things, and how can Primer help them with that?
Well, I think aside from technology, which actually is still a very, very big component of all of this, you mentioned regulation and kind of local issues. SCA is a really, really good example of this, right? So SCA has been pushed back multiple times, and we know this to be true because nobody's been able to kind of react quickly enough. How does a merchant who has a multitude of different payment services and various payment flows now have implement 3D Secure 2.0 across the variety of processes and services that they're leveraging in some form of unified way and via some cohesive checkout experience? Well, it turns out they can't really do that because they don't have a unified technical infrastructure to begin with, right? But I think aside from all of that, payments is remarkably unintuitive. And so that's something that Gabs and I know very, very, very well.
So Gabriel, I've got to ask, what's the solution? How do you guys help large merchants create this strategy and globally expand with their payments?
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you're mentioning here. I think no one has been, really helping merchant so far today, right? Like you look at all these different services. What they're trying to actually get is, adopt my product, right? I'm the best among my competitors. When we go and talk to a merchant at Primer, we have an agnostic hat, right? We don't have any preferred partner. We're looking at the entire payment ecosystem, right? We're looking at the entire payment stack, right? So, the position of Primer is, let's actually discuss about your payments roadmap. And I think I want to double click on that. I'm talking about a payments roadmap. So merchant have essentially a list of services they want to add over 12 to 18 months. They want to actually optimize their checkout. They want to launch globally. They want to actually create a cohesive fraud strategy. They want to optimize payout. They want to optimize ACA, all these type of things. But they really don't have anyone to talk to about that, that payments roadmap. But now they have someone, which is Primer, because we're just looking at all these different challenges they have at all these different projects. And with the product we've built, we can actually help them accelerate each of them, right? So I think, the reason why maybe there is a lack of education is because no one has been here to help, the merchant actually understand how they should do things. But with Primer, we have, expertise. We know, how to define an efficient payment strategy and how, things can be accelerated. And that's essentially what we're providing to the merchant with a beautiful platform with a very simple product. And
can we actually go into the product a bit more than that, Gabriel? Talking about that, the view that you give these merchants. Some of these merchants I imagine you guys are working with are quite big, and so can you provide them with that consolidated, almost automated view?
Absolutely. I mean, Primer in itself is a very simple product, right? We have like three principles. Like we have a unified checkout, connections, and workflow, right? And with that, you can solve like pretty much like all the challenges that the merchant will have, right? And as soon as Primer is integrated, if you want to actually like launch in the Netherlands with Ideal and in Brazil with Boleto, and you want to actually optimize your fraud strategy with a fraud provider, it's one click in the dashboard. So we're giving like those like payments team like superpower now. They can actually accelerate their strategy. They don't have to rely on like other like stakeholders in their company to actually learn how to integrate a new service with technology. But what's very interesting is that now that you have Primer integrated, anyone can look at payments to actually engage and create new type of experiences. If you're in marketing, I'm sure you want to actually attract new customers with Klarna. But today you have to wait for the team to learn how to integrate Klarna and get them to integrate a product and learn how to use the dashboard and all these type of things. But now with Primer, the CMO or the marketing team, they can go in the dashboard, click Klarna, create a workflow. They find like to which user like Klarna should be shown. That's it. So this is what we're providing to the market, like what we're bringing to the market. Sorry.
That's absolutely
like looking at payments as a way to accelerate your strategy.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that just a little bit, because it was something that Gabs mentioned earlier, which is that actually at Primer, our vision really isn't to just consolidate a merchant's payments ecosystem. Our vision is to make payments the first-class product area in the merchant organization. So we take inspirations from the likes of Figma or Airtable or Tableau or so on and so forth, right? Whereby now more stakeholders in the company can actually work with payments and actually contribute towards building a payment strategy and a payments experience for their customers. I don't know if you've used Figma, Doug. I suspect maybe. Maybe. Okay. Well, Figma is a design tool that enables anybody in the company to kind of comment on or contribute to design in some form or fashion. Well, prior to Figma and prior to tools like Figma, if one of your team wanted to send you the design for the new website or something, maybe they'd send you an Adobe Illustrator file, and then you'd have to download Adobe Illustrator and maybe buy a Adobe Illustrator for Dummies book, and you'd have to do all of that, right? But with Figma, it's just like remarkable. Design can now be a first-class product area within your organization, and that's what we want to do for payments. Because today, payments, even in remarkably large merchant organizations, payments is something that you really don't want to touch. It's kind of, on its last legs. It's really just kind of, hacked together. And Primer, we want to change the kind of narrative, and we want to bring a new paradigm into a merchant organization where it's just as easy to work with payments as it is to add some new design components with all of the software libraries we have available for that today. And the last thing I'll say about that, have you ever noticed when you go to a merchant website, they've spent maybe hundreds of millions on their marketing and branding, and they've hired supermodels and the whole thing, but the worst page is always the checkout page. Every other page is better than the checkout page, and so that's because payments really isn't a true first-class product area within their particular service or website or what have you. And so that's what Primer wants to bring to the table.
So I mean, to finish off then, Gabriel, can I ask you, what are the opportunities for merchants currently, and how can they get access to these opportunities?
Well, the opportunity for the merchant right now is actually having the ability to use all these amazing services, right? And really, create unique commerce experiences with them, right? I think this is, I think in some of the discussions we had, like with other partners or like media, one of the question was like, what is innovation in payments? Well, for us is, allowing those merchants to create new and unique experiences with all those amazing services. This is essentially what we're bringing to the market. So this is like the opportunity for us. And again, like helping the merchants to accelerate with all the services they want, right? If they want to launch into a new market, they should be able to do it in just a few clicks, right? They should be able to do it in just a few days. If they want to solve like their fraud strategy, like across their payment stack, they should be able to do it as well. And all these things are like solved by Primer, right? And again, it's because we're like an agnostic open payments infrastructure. We work with anyone on the market today. Any services can be on Primer, and we'll discover like new things as well, right? When we talk to merchant, we discover like new type of flows all the time, and we see them like creating like unique workflows on Primer, which is like fascinating. So I think for me, again, the opportunity is, well, giving the ability to use all these services, create new unique experiences, and all that in order to accept more payments and provide, customer with a beautiful checkout.
That's absolutely brilliant. And Paul, also, can I get your perspective as well on the opportunities that merchants can have to wrap up?
Yeah, I think that, I think the way that we think about it from a technology standpoint is that really Primer is, it's as much a tool for the internet as it is for merchants, right? Because at the end of the day, there's never before been a completely open and unified and agnostic technical infrastructure for payments. So now any third-party service can freely integrate with Primer using our open application framework, which we call Primer Connect. So it's not just Primer that's building these integrations. Very soon, we're going to be releasing public APIs that enable anybody to build an integration on Primer. And it could be a PSP, it could be a payment method, it could be a communication tool, it could be an email service, it could be anything. And that can be very seamlessly dragged into workflows and can form part of a payment lifecycle. And we don't charge third parties anything to integrate with Primer. Not only is Primer the world's first true payments infrastructure, we're also the world's first open payments infrastructure. And so, as I say, we very much see ourselves a little bit like Zapier for payments, but Primer wants to be a springboard for all new products and technologies that come out in the payment space or anything that could potentially form as part of a payment lifecycle. And really, that's how we think about the future of Primer.
So guys, I've got to ask, where can our audience find out more about Primer and what can we hear from Primer about in the future?
You can find us on primer.io, and you can find Gabriel and myself on LinkedIn. And we have some very exciting developments coming up within the next few weeks. So you should look out for those.
Perfect. Thanks so much, guys. And also thank you to our audience. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at www.fintechf.com and of course, YouTube and LinkedIn. Well, I'll see you in the comments. So once again, guys, thank you very much and goodbye.